but I guess it's not gonna happen. All right. So today we're talking about psychological research, and we try really hard to be a real research, a real field of research, and it's hard because we can't study things as clearly as like physics researchers can, or biological researchers, or anybody who's studying something that's tangible, something that you can touch. It's much easier to use the scientific method with that. In social science research, it's much harder to prove something because the things that we're dealing with are things that you can't take out a ruler and measure most of the time, right? There are some things that we can look at that way, like somebody's income, right? Somebody's SATs, things like that. But then there are a lot of things we can't study that way, like people's happiness, people's self-esteem, people's marital satisfaction. So there are a lot of variables that we can't kind of get at the way we want to, the way somebody in a hard science could. So what we have to do is we try to use the scientific method, just like other scientists use. And what that does is it applies the empirical method. And the empirical method is when you don't just make up a theory about something, you then observe the thing that you have a theory about and see if predictions that you make about that thing based on your theory come true. So it's okay to say, yeah, if you raise a kid right, they end up happy in their adulthood. That's like a big, wide, vague theory that a lot of people believe. But it's a different thing to pick a specific hypothesis that can be tested. Like if you look at kids with their caregivers in a situation, there's a really famous one called the strange situation procedure that I'll probably show you at some point. And those kids look like they have a really good secure attachment with their parents. They have fewer psychological disorders when they grow up. And people have actually found that to be true. So you've got the theory that parenting predicts psychological health, good parenting predicts psychological health. And then you have a hypothesis that, if that's true, kids who look securely attached when they're studied with their parents or whoever takes care of them in this lab setting, with their parents being videotaped, if they look securely attached in that situation, then if you study them 25 years later, they're going to have fewer dissociative disorders, they're going to have less depression, they're going to have less anxiety. And people have done longitudinal studies on that. A longitudinal study is when, you start when the participants are one age, and then you keep studying them throughout their lifetimes. So in my postdoctoral fellowship, by the time I was working with my mentor, her participants were about 17, 18, and she had been studying them since their mothers were pregnant with them. She had already been studying them, from when I was about 13 was when she started studying them. And then now they're probably, let's see, how long ago was that? Now they're probably at least 30, right? So, or 35. Yeah. So she's still studying them. So that's a longitudinal study. And the benefit of doing that is you can't really mess up those data as much as you can something where you study a bunch of people right now and then you study a bunch of similar people at the same time, and you find that the ones who have that kids who have good relationships, who are like 25 right now, who had good relationships when they were younger, are more healthy, because you don't really know for sure that it's because of that. You can't kind of tease out all the other things like you could in a longitudinal study. So the empirical method really requires you to prove something instead of just think it and make a good logical argument for it. You can't just get published because you have a great idea and you make a good argument for it. You have to prove it's true by doing a study. Okay. So the process starts with, you kind of, I'm sure you guys actually observe each other all the time. When you're trying to figure out who you want to hang out with, who you want to date, you're looking around at people, to figure out who you're interested in, who you think might be interested in you, what kinds of things you want to do. Other things you might be making observations about are like whatever it is you're interested in, if it's a sport, if it's some kind of art, if it's a particular career, there's probably people you're looking at who you want to emulate, and you're trying to make observations about who succeeds in that area, right? Like, oh, the people who, make it the furthest in the NFL, those are the ones who do this, this, and this, right? And those are the questions that you're asking, what attracts people to each other? What makes a football player make it to the NFL and succeed? What makes people succeed well in college? What makes people have successful long-term relationships? These are all questions some of you have probably asked, and then others of you have other questions that I haven't thought of yet, right? And then you have a hypothesis about them, right? Actually, a really common question that a lot of college students have is, why does that person act that way, right? Like if you're just completely baffled by the way one of your peers acts or your roommate, and you've never met somebody who responds this way to you or to whatever's going on, and it's kind of distressing. The question is, why are they doing this, right? And then you kind of come up with a hypothesis. And, one easy hypothesis is, oh, because this person's a jerk, right? And you go around and like it's temperamental. This person has a personality disorder or something. And then sometimes you might go around and be like, what do you think of this person? And like try to get evidence that other people have, experienced this and blah. But that isn't necessarily proof that this person was born with genes that makes them act the way they do, right? So maybe you have a hypothesis that they had a series of bad relationships, or they were neglected as a child, or they've never been told no, or whatever. Then you make a prediction based on that hypothesis, right? That if that was the case, then in general, people who are never told no will act entitled and demand things that aren't theirs, like if that's what your roommate's doing to you or whatever. And then you do an experiment, right? And you get a whole bunch of people around that age randomly, well, not randomly, you'd give them a survey, maybe. I mean, this is one way you could do it, and say, how strict were the people who brought you up? How often were you told no? Were you generally given things you asked for? That kind of thing. And then maybe put them in a setting where, like a controlled laboratory setting where they're with a bunch of peers and they have to do a group task, and they're in a situation where each person needs stuff and who's going to take more of the resources that are available to them, right? And you could see if there's some kind of correlation between the kids who were never told no when they were younger and who takes more of the resources in the group setting with their peers, or something like that, right? So you have to find that was off the top of my head and probably not the clearest, most elegant research design ever thrown together. But basically, you have to come up with an experiment that will test the prediction that proves your hypothesis, right? So like a common hypothesis that graduate admissions programs have is that people who score high on their GREs will do better in graduate programs. So like the GREs are like one of the forms of tests that you can take that's a lot like an SAT, but it's for getting into graduate school, right? So the theory is that people with certain aptitudes, certain intellectual abilities, will score higher on the GRE, and those people will do better in graduate school. Okay. So that's the prediction. Higher GREs will be correlated with GPA and success in graduate school. Well, that's a pretty easy experiment to do, right? You can just see if scores among the graduate students in your program are, high scores correlate with higher scores in their grades in the graduate program, right? And if they graduate on time, if they have good relationships with their peers and their instructors, things like that, right? And then you analyze the results. So you see if your prediction comes out the way you expected it to. And if it doesn't, you have to try again. Now, there's a couple ways you can try again if your experiment doesn't come out the way you expected it to. Say you're doing, the study where, you think kids who are kind of spoiled growing up will act like they're entitled to more group resources and like a group project in college. And that doesn't come out. The statistics don't show that there's a correlation. How might you try again? There's some different ways you might kind of start over. Can you think of some things that might have gone wrong? Or like, could the hypothesis still be true, but something went wrong? Amanda?
Sometimes there could be a flaw in kind of the experiment, maybe like something happens and like your results get mixed up.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah,
it possibly could be true, but also since your experiment got messed up, it doesn't prove the hypothesis to be correct.
right. Definitely. Good. And Venetia?
Also, the population sometimes is not the right one for the study, and that can make some errors and mistakes during the process.
Right. So sometimes the sample that you got out of the population isn't representative. So you got some kind of weird sample, and that therefore your results didn't come out, right? Like, so if you're studying the effects of a drug on depression, right? And you had two groups of depressed people, and you put one in a control group that got like a sugar pill or nothing, and then you put the other group of depressed people on the medication, and there was no difference between them. The people on the medication didn't get any better. What if this particular group of people that you sampled from were people in a locked psychiatric unit? Now, people get into locked psychiatric units because they're a danger to themselves or others, right? So these are going to be the most severe cases. So you have a skewed sample. You have a sample that's not representative of all depressed people, which would be a good sample if you were particularly interested in trying to figure out if it works on people with severe depression with suicidal tendencies, right? So yeah, you could have something wrong with your study. There could be a confounding factor, like something that wasn't controlled, like your population is really skewed or biased somehow, right? Can you think of other reasons your study might not work out? Has anybody been in a study yet? I think I saw one person that had been in a study already, maybe two. Good job, by the way. Amanda?
I know most good studies are randomized, so maybe they didn't randomize either the controlled, like for the control or the placebo. So like the scientists either like just chose people to be in the placebo or the controlled.
Mhm.
So that could also be a founding factor of why the hypothesis is incorrect.
Right. Yeah. And some people do that and it makes them get significant results that look good when actually their study didn't prove what they thought it did, because they put people who, of course, would respond well to whatever the condition was in the condition program, in the condition group, and then people who wouldn't have responded well in the control group, right? Like if you were doing like whether the learn to read program would work for young children, and you took all professors' kids and put them in the treatment group, the people who got the learn to read program, and then you took people from the general population and put them in the control group. Yeah, the professors' kids are going to learn to read better, but you don't know if it's because of the learn to read program. It might be because professors tend to have a ton of books in their house, right? They tend to read to their kids. They're really into education, obviously. You know what I mean? So there's a whole bunch of alternative explanations besides the hypothesis, right? And what if you have a measure that's not really good? Like that's something we do all the time. We go, okay, I want to measure jealousy. So I'm going to make up a survey, and I'm going to ask, 30 questions that ask people how jealous they are. Well, what if that survey doesn't make sense to people, or they can tell what you're asking and don't want to look jealous, so they lie on it, or they don't care, so they just answer right down the middle. How many of you have filled out course evaluations for some of your courses already? At the end of the semester, you say, this course was pretty good. The teacher was okay at this, not so good at that. How many of you have done that yet? Not that many yet? Okay. Like, sorry, I want to look at the whole class. So, like, were you totally invested in that? Did you spend a long time on each question?
I think it just depended on the course. Like if I had a bad course, I'd be mad honest in it. And then if it was like a good course, I just say like what they did good and bad, or like just like be honest too. Like I don't know.
Right. So, like, that's what happens a lot. If you have a really extreme feeling about something and you really want to, get that message across, you might really pay attention and give extreme answers. And a lot of times they used to have it so, like, if you hadn't filled it out yet, you had to fill it out to get your grades. Do they still do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always like, don't do that. Don't piss off my students right before they evaluate me, please. That could skew the results, right? Like, oh, fine, I have to do this. Crappy, 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 crappy. You might already be mad, and it could like put like the opposite of rose-colored glasses on you, right? But a lot of people are just trying to fill out annoying surveys quickly. So, if it's a 1 to 5 scale, they're like 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, exit or submit, right? So there's a lot of reasons why studies may not have come out. And if you go back and look at them, you can redo them. Sometimes there's a problem with that, right? What could be the problem if you always do that every time your results don't come out? What's the problem with that? If you go back and tweak it every time you don't get every time your hypothesis isn't proven.
You will never finish the project.
right? Especially if, like, what if somebody's hypothesis is wrong?
It's okay. You just have to declare the reasons why they're wrong, and that's it. But you
Right.
have to explain yourself. Like you have to use arguments. Like, okay,
Well, supposedly that's fine, right? The only problem is the way things are set up in psychology is if your hypothesis doesn't come out, you don't get published. So unless you prove your hypothesis, you can't get your article published in a journal. So sometimes you'll work on a study, like my dissertation took me like, I don't know, 4 years or something. And some little tiny part of it came out, like really the main parts that were really good with the really good measures in it didn't come out. And I had to publish the parts I was like least proud of, like based on surveys and stuff. And there's like a big pull there to go back and look at it a new way, like 10,000 times until I can publish it. Right. And a ton of people do that, but it's unethical because what statistics is proving is that 95 times out of 100, you would get this result proving your hypothesis. Right. And so say, you do 100 tests, 5 of them are going to come out saying, oh yeah, this hypothesis is right, even if it's wrong. You know what I'm saying? So if you do enough tests, eventually something's going to say, yeah, this hypothesis is good. So you could end up publishing something that's not correct. The other thing is because we don't get published unless we get good results, there's a million studies on professor offices floors that didn't come out. So we don't know, like we can go to the literature and say, hey, has this been studied before? And is there any evidence for it? And the only thing we'll find is maybe the 3 studies that showed, yeah, there is some evidence for this. And there may be 30,000 studies on the floors of professors' offices across the country that didn't come out, and we'll never see them because they didn't make it to the journal, right? So that's an issue. So some of the the empirical method is the best we have, so we have to use it. And if our hypothesis isn't proven, yeah, we have to reasonably make an attempt to make sure our study was good. But then after a while, if it's still not coming out, we have to just get out of denial and accept that perhaps we may have been wrong and move on. Right? That's humility. That's called humility. Being humble enough to say, perhaps I was wrong. And it's a thing that's very hard for professors to do. We tend to think we're really smart, right? Have you noticed this? And we want to think that we don't make a lot of mistakes. So, and we really hate putting, 2, 3, 4 years into something and then not getting published. That's a drag, right? So, all right. And then when it comes out, it says, this little table says whether the hypothesis is correct or not, you report the results. Well, good luck reporting incorrect hypotheses. It's a lot harder. Okay. All right. So a hypothesis is a testable statement about something. It's going to be more detailed, more specific. And the theory is the background, more vague ideas behind the hypothesis. Does that make sense to people? So I think there were some questions in your text that asked you about that, right? And the way you figured out which answer was correct was the hypothesis was always the more specific of the 2, right? Did you guys get that? So can somebody give me an example of a hypothesis that could be generated from a theory? like a theory you might have, and how you might generate a testable statement, like a hypothesis from a theory? Like, do you have a theory about dating? Do you have a theory about what works in college? Do you have a theory about what athletes succeed? Um,
I have a theory that out of all the countries, United States is probably going to be in the pandemic the longest.
okay.
That's my
And
theory.
okay, and so how would you test it?
Just basing off of like cases and like who has it and who doesn't, I guess.
Right. And what's the, so in a theory, there's usually like a why explanation. So what would your explanation be for why we'd be in the pandemic the longest?
I feel like this country's like more selfish than other countries, and like some people just keep acting like it's not a thing.
Okay. So like by not wearing masks and stuff like that. Okay. So one of the hypotheses, so one of the things you test is whether we just have it longer, right? Like whether we, you just look back once COVID is under control and just see if truly we had it longer than other countries, right? What's something else you could test? Like it sounds like you think there's a correlation between two things. What are those two things? Can somebody,
So does it have to be me or somebody else can say something?
I'm thinking somebody else could say it too.
Cool.
Kind of a type of personality. What's the personality type we're talking about?
Selfish.
Selfish. Who said that?
Patrick.
Oh, hi, Patrick. Okay. Okay, so there's a correlation whereby more selfish people are going to end up what? What's the outcome?
Pushing back the length of the pandemic.
Yeah, they're gonna extend the length of the pandemic, right? Because they won't do stuff like stay home, wear masks, and stuff like that. So, in addition to studying whether the U.S. has the pandemic longer, you could also study whether the U.S. Scores higher on measures of selfishness and scores higher on refusing to wear masks, refusing to stay home, whatever it is that you think is the pandemic related selfishness behavior, Laura, right? So there'd be like a whole bunch of surveys you could come up with. I'm sure there are already selfishness surveys out there, so you could find already well validated ones, and then you'd have to come up with what you think the most selfish behaviors are. And I think even though it's self-report, because what are some of the problems with self-report measures? Anyone? Like if you're saying what you're like, if you're saying somebody gives you a survey and you're like, oh, I'm this way and that way, what are some of the problems with that?
Try and be the best and not say your flaws.
Yeah, people tend to be like, oh yeah, I'm fabulous in every way, right? Or if they're like, what always cracks me up is the best survey for juvenile delinquency is self-report. And I'm like, so they're the best study for like how many crimes you commit, how many drugs you do, how many people you stab and stuff like that is self-report. But ironically, a lot of people with antisocial tendencies are kind of proud of it. So if they know for sure that it's confidential and that there are no repercussions, that these surveys aren't going to be sent to law enforcement agencies, they're kind of okay with handing that back to the experimenter. And in your experience, if you've ever confronted anybody or seen somebody confronted who's not wearing a mask or who won't stay home, do you think they perceive themselves as selfish?
No, I don't think so.
Are they going to be ashamed to say that they don't wear a mask?
No.
Right. So oftentimes it's almost like a point is made of it, right? So I think you'd actually still get really good data even if you used self-report. So that would be pretty cool. That'd be a pretty cool study, actually. So yeah, the theory is that, you know, selfish people won't stay home and wear masks to shorten the length of the pandemic, and people from the US are more selfish and therefore engage in less mask wearing and less quarantining, and therefore the length of the pandemic is extended. Right? Those are the hypotheses. The theory is that, you know, Americans are selfish and make things worse for themselves because of it. You know, it's the more vague statement is the theory. The testable little statements are the hypothesis. Does that make sense to people? This is just saying what I just said. The thing to notice here is that, you know, the first thing you do is come up with a theory. Then you make testable hypotheses and do research. You know, your theory is based on things you've seen and read in the world, right? And then this research gives you more things to observe. You know, and then based on those observations, you can change your theory, right? Nobody does though. It's like, that's one of my problems with people in the field is that a lot of people focus too much on proving their theory they started with and less on modifying their theory to take into account new information, right? So that's something that I would recommend you do more, that would separate you from your peers if you become researchers. So you have to be all of these things. Your research has to be all of these things if it's going to be good. It has to be fair. You can't just use some parts of your data. You can't just like conveniently delete a few participants that keep your data from coming out the way you want it to. Your theory and hypotheses have to be falsifiable. You know, like unlike Freud's theory, that's like, oh, you know, it's all in your unconscious. And you say, no, it's not. And then they say, well, you don't know it is because it's an unconscious thing. You know, it can't be tautological. You have to be able to disprove it. You know, it's different if it's a faith-based religion. Yeah, you don't have to prove it. It can be based on faith. But if it's empirical research, it can't be based on faith. You can't just go, trust me, you know, trust me, take this pill. No, there has to be evidence that the pill works, right? It doesn't have terrible side effects. And a good theory helps us make predictions about future events. Otherwise, what's the point of it, right? You want to be able, you know, if we say things about people and figure out things about people, the reason why is to figure out like, what's this person's prognosis? What's going to happen to this person next psychologically? And if we do X, Y, or Z, can that enhance this person's life? Or if we prevent X, Y, or Z from happening, can that protect this person's life, right? That's why we want to make predictions, so we can intervene in a positive manner. That's the whole point of psychological research. So we get betterment of people's, you know, lives and plights, right? And then an experiment has to be verifiable. It doesn't matter if you can do something over and over and over again and fix people, because there's too many people in the world. It has to be something that can be replicated, that can be copied. It has to be done in such a standard way that other people can do it, so that it will help all people or a huge number of people, not just the 100 people you can treat in your lifetime. Okay, well, we have to stop. I'm sorry that I had technical difficulties, but hopefully next time I'll have it ironed out someday. All right. Take care. See you guys Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye. Oh, did you receive the video?
I don't